Maybe start with cleaning duty, rookie. The laughter came fast, sharp, and confident, bouncing off the gray walls of the roll call room before sunrise had fully reached the station windows. A few officers smirked into their coffee cups. Others exchanged knowing looks. At the center of it all stood Sergeant Ryan Keller, arms folded across his chest, wearing the relaxed grin of a man who believed everyone in the room already belonged to his side. Near the back wall, beside a row of dented lockers and a bulletin board covered in faded notices, Officer Ava Brooks stood quietly with a small duffel bag resting near her feet. She had arrived less than 20 minutes earlier. Her uniform was crisp. Her badge reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. She neither smiled nor frowned. She simply watched. Ryan tilted his head toward a janitor's cart parked outside the open doorway. "Don't worry," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We all start somewhere." More laughter followed. Someone tapped a desk. Another officer shook his head while trying not to laugh. Ava remained still. The station smelled faintly of old coffee, printer toner, and rain-soaked pavement drifting in through the front entrance every time it opened. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, the room had already decided who she was. A rookie. An outsider. Someone easy to dismiss. Ryan took a slow sip from his coffee and looked her up and down. "You got a name, officer?" Ava met his eyes. "Ava Brooks, sir." Her voice was calm, steady, almost quiet. The answer somehow disappointed him. There was no nervousness. No attitude. No reaction. Just confidence without performance. "Brooks," Ryan repeated. "Good. Try not to get lost. This place is bigger than the academy." The room chuckled again. Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." That answer earned another round of amused looks. Most people defended themselves. Most people tried to prove something. She did neither. The digital clock above the briefing screen clicked to 5:58 a.m. 2 minutes before roll call officially began. Officers continued filing into the room, some carrying folders, others balancing breakfast sandwiches and oversized travel mugs. A few glanced toward Ava before turning away. One officer whispered something to his partner. Both laughed. Ava pretended not to notice. Through the large station window, flashing red lights from a patrol unit briefly painted the glass. The reflection swept across the room and disappeared. Ryan stepped toward the front podium. "Listen up," he called. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. Coffee cups settled onto desks. Ava remained near the back. Observing. Listening. Learning. She noticed the worn carpet. The cracked corner of the briefing screen. The officers who commanded attention and the ones who avoided it. Most importantly, she noticed who laughed when Ryan spoke and who stayed silent. Experience had taught her that silence often revealed more than words. "We've got a busy day," Ryan announced. "And apparently we've got fresh recruits joining us." A few heads turned toward Ava again. Ryan smiled. "Let's hope she survives her first week." The room erupted once more. This time the laughter lasted longer. Ava looked toward the front of the room, her expression unchanged. The morning light finally slipped through the blinds, casting pale gold lines across the floor between rows of boots and desk legs. For a brief moment, everything seemed frozen inside that glow. The laughter. The assumptions. The confidence. The certainty. None of them knew why she had really come. None of them knew who she truly was. And in less than 24 hours, every person in that room would wish they had treated the woman in the back row very differently. Ava Brooks spent the rest of the morning doing exactly what nobody expected her to do. She listened. While the station buzzed with radio traffic, ringing phones, and hurried conversations, she moved quietly through each assignment handed to her. She completed reports without mistakes. She checked vehicle logs that had been ignored for weeks. She reviewed equipment inventories and noticed missing entries that nobody else seemed concerned about. By noon, several officers had already forgotten she was there. That was fine with Ava. In her experience, people revealed the most about themselves when they believed nobody important was watching. Around 1 o'clock, she stepped outside into the parking lot carrying a clipboard. The summer air was warm, and sunlight reflected off rows of patrol vehicles lined neatly across the cracked asphalt. A flag above the station fluttered lazily against a cloudless blue sky. Ava paused for a moment and looked toward the city skyline rising in the distance. It had taken her 7 hours of driving to reach this department. 7 hours and nearly 20 years of work. She remembered studying under dim apartment lights after long shifts. She remembered academy instructors who doubted her. She remembered promotions that came slower than they should have. Most of all, she remembered her father. Officer Marcus Brooks had worn a badge in a neighborhood where trust was fragile and every decision mattered. Growing up, Ava had watched him leave for work before sunrise and return long after dark. He used to tell her that respect could never be demanded. It had to be earned every single day. The memory brought a faint smile to her face before she returned to her work. Back inside the station, Ryan Keller stood near the dispatch desk joking with several officers. The moment he noticed Ava walking through the hallway, he lowered his voice and smirked. "How is inventory duty treating you?" he asked. Ava glanced at the clipboard in her hand. "Everything is accounted for except 3 radios and 2 vehicle cameras." The answer caught him off guard. One of the officers nearby looked surprised. Ryan recovered quickly. "Congratulations. Maybe we should put you in charge of office supplies." A few people laughed. Ava simply nodded and continued walking. As she disappeared around the corner, Officer Daniel Price watched her go. "She does not seem bothered by any of this," he said quietly. Ryan shrugged. "Give it time." But Daniel was not so sure. Most rookies arrived nervous. Most tried to fit in. Most wanted approval. Ava seemed interested in none of those things. Later that afternoon, while reviewing old departmental reports in a small records room, Ava noticed something else. Staff turnover had increased dramatically over the past 3 years. Internal complaints had risen. Performance ratings had slipped. The deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. This department was not struggling because of resources. It was struggling because leadership had stopped listening. Ava closed the file slowly. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hallway, laughter echoed from the break room. She sat back in her chair and stared at the stack of reports in front of her. The problems were bigger than anyone realized. And by this time tomorrow, the responsibility for fixing all of them would belong to her. The next morning arrived with a layer of gray clouds hanging low over the city. Rain tapped softly against the station windows as officers filtered into the building carrying coffee cups and damp jackets. Ava Brooks arrived before most of them. By 6 o'clock she was already seated in the records room reviewing another stack of departmental reports. The station was quiet at that hour. Only the distant hum of fluorescent lights and occasional radio chatter disturbed the silence. Ava turned another page and frowned slightly. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Response times had increased. Community satisfaction ratings had declined. Internal training programs had been reduced. The department was functioning, but only barely. Someone had been managing problems instead of solving them. The door opened. Officer Daniel Price stepped inside holding a paper cup. "You are here early," he said. Ava glanced up. "Could say the same thing about you." Daniel smiled faintly. "Fair enough." He hesitated before setting a second coffee on the edge of her desk. "Black coffee." "I guessed." Ava looked at the cup. Thank you. Daniel nodded toward the files. You planning to read the entire department? Maybe. That answer earned a quiet laugh. For the first time since arriving, Ava saw genuine friendliness instead of judgment. Daniel leaned against a cabinet. You know, Keller usually scares off new officers within a few hours. Ava took a sip of coffee. I noticed. Most people react. And what happens when they do? Daniel considered the question. Usually exactly what he expects. Ava nodded thoughtfully. The conversation ended when a dispatcher's voice echoed through the hallway announcing the morning briefing. Within minutes, the roll call room filled once again. Chairs scraped across the floor. Conversations overlapped. Phones buzzed. Ryan Keller stood near the front speaking confidently to a cluster of officers. He looked completely at home. Completely certain. Ava quietly took a seat near the back. Ryan began assigning duties for the day. Patrol zones. Traffic details. Community outreach visits. Then his eyes landed on Ava. Brooks. The room became slightly quieter. You can handle evidence inventory at the storage annex. A few officers exchanged amused looks. It was another assignment nobody wanted. Ava simply wrote it down. Anything else, Sergeant? Ryan smiled. No complaints? Should there be? A couple officers looked away to hide their reactions. Ryan's smile tightened. Not yet. The briefing continued. 20 minutes later, Ava found herself driving an aging department vehicle toward the annex building located several blocks away. Rain streaked across the windshield. The city moved slowly beneath the overcast sky. As traffic lights reflected on wet pavement, she thought about the officers she had met during the past 24 hours. Some seemed exhausted. Some seemed frustrated. Some had stopped believing improvement was possible. And one man seemed determined to prove that authority belonged to him. Ava parked beside the annex and switched off the engine. For a moment she remained still, listening to raindrops drum softly against the roof. Tomorrow everything would change. But today she still had one more chance to learn who these people truly were when they believed nobody was paying attention. By late afternoon the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath a pale silver sky. Ava Brooks returned to the station carrying 2 folders from the annex and a notebook filled with observations. The building felt different than it had that morning. Officers moved through the hallways with the tired rhythm of people approaching the end of a long shift. Phones rang less often. Conversations grew quieter. Somewhere in the distance, a copier hummed steadily. Ava stepped into the squad room and placed the folders on an empty desk. Before she could sit down, Ryan Keller appeared beside her. Brooks. She looked up. Sergeant. Ryan tapped one of the folders. I heard you spent half the day counting evidence boxes. Most of the day. Exciting work. His tone drew a few smiles from nearby officers. Ava remained calm. It was useful. Ryan laughed softly. Useful? I found missing inventory records that should have been updated months ago. The room became slightly quieter. Ryan's smile faded for a fraction of a second. I am sure that is very impressive. Ava nodded. It might help during the next audit. One officer looked away to hide a grin. Another suddenly became interested in his computer screen. Ryan cleared his throat. Good to know. He walked away, but the confidence in his stride seemed slightly less certain than before. Ava sat down and opened her notebook. Throughout the afternoon she continued reviewing reports, training records, and personnel evaluations. The more she learned, the more one thing became clear. The department was filled with capable people. What it lacked was direction. Several younger officers had excellent performance reviews but little mentorship. Community programs had been reduced despite positive results. Equipment requests sat unanswered for months. None of the problems were impossible to fix. They simply required someone willing to address them. As evening approached, Officer Daniel Price stopped by her desk again. "You ever take a break?" he asked. Ava smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Daniel pulled up a chair. "Most people spend their first week trying not to drown." "Maybe I like paperwork." "Nobody likes paperwork." Ava laughed quietly. The sound surprised even her. Daniel leaned back. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends." "Why transfer here?" Ava closed the folder in front of her. For a moment she studied the fading sunlight reflecting across the station floor. "Because sometimes the places that need help the most are the places everyone else avoids." Daniel considered that answer. "That sounds rehearsed." "Maybe it is." Before he could ask another question, a dispatcher's voice echoed across the room. A community meeting scheduled for the next evening needed department representatives. Several officers immediately looked away. Nobody volunteered. Ryan emerged from his office carrying a tablet. "Fine," he said. "Price, you are going." Daniel sighed dramatically. "Of course I am." Ryan scanned the room and then looked directly at Ava. "Brooks, you can go with him. Consider it educational." A few officers exchanged knowing looks. Community meetings were often treated as punishment assignments. Ava simply stood and gathered her notebook. "What time?" she asked. Ryan seemed disappointed that she had not complained. 6 o'clock. "We will be there." As the shift wound down and officers began heading home, Ava remained seated at her desk. The station slowly emptied around her. Outside the windows, the last light of day disappeared behind the skyline. She looked toward Ryan's office. The blinds were closed. The door was shut. Inside, he was probably planning tomorrow's assignments, fully convinced he understood everyone under his command. Ava lowered her eyes to the notebook resting in front of her. In less than 24 hours, that assumption would become his biggest mistake. The following afternoon began with unexpected tension hanging over the station like a storm cloud that nobody could see. Officers moved through the building faster than usual. Radios crackled constantly. Dispatch requests stacked up. Even the conversations in the hallways felt sharper. Ava Brooks noticed it immediately. She and Daniel Price had just returned from reviewing materials for the evening community meeting when a dispatcher hurried across the room carrying a tablet. "We have a problem," she said. Within minutes several supervisors gathered around a conference table near the center of the operations floor. A major charity event scheduled for the next morning had suddenly changed locations due to construction issues. Hundreds of residents were expected to attend. Traffic control plans were now useless. Parking routes were wrong. Volunteer assignments no longer matched the new layout. Confusion spread quickly. Ryan Keller stepped forward and began issuing instructions. Officers scrambled to update maps and reroute personnel. The more information arrived, however, the more complicated the situation became. Ava stood quietly near the edge of the room listening. She watched officers interrupt one another. She watched deadlines tighten. Most importantly, she noticed a critical detail nobody else seemed to see. The revised traffic pattern would funnel vehicles directly into a school pickup zone less than 30 minutes before dismissal. Delays would be inevitable. Frustrated parents would overwhelm the area. The entire plan would collapse before the event even started. Ava waited. Ryan continued assigning resources. Another supervisor nodded in agreement. A third officer began printing route maps. Still nobody mentioned the school. Ava glanced at Daniel. He looked uncertain. Finally she stepped forward. "Sergeant." Ryan barely looked at her. "What?" Ava placed a finger on the map spread across the table. "This route crosses Jefferson Elementary during dismissal hours." Several heads turned. Ryan frowned. "And?" "Traffic volume will double. Possibly triple. Vehicles leaving the event and parents arriving at the school will meet at the same intersection." Silence followed. One lieutenant leaned closer to the map. Another officer checked the schedule. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Ryan folded his arms. "We already approved the route." Ava remained calm. "Then we should reconsider it." The room grew very still. Nobody liked contradicting Ryan Keller in front of other officers. He stared at her for several seconds. "You have been here less than 2 days." His voice remained controlled, but the irritation underneath was impossible to miss. "Correct," Ava replied. "The intersection is still a problem." A few officers exchanged nervous glances. Ryan pointed toward the map. "We do not have enough personnel to redesign everything." Ava nodded. "Actually, we do." She quickly outlined an alternative route using existing resources. No additional staffing. No extra overtime. No disruption to the school schedule. The solution was simple. Practical. Effective. For a moment nobody spoke. Then one of the lieutenants slowly nodded. "That would work." Another supervisor agreed. "It solves the bottleneck." Daniel looked openly impressed. Ryan's jaw tightened. The room was no longer looking at him. They were looking at Ava. Not as a rookie. Not as an outsider. As someone who had identified a problem and solved it in less than 60 seconds. Ryan gathered the maps abruptly. "Fine. Use the new route." The meeting ended moments later, but the atmosphere had changed. As officers returned to their duties, whispers followed Ava through the operations floor. For the first time since arriving, people were beginning to question the assumptions they had made about her. And Ryan Keller could feel it happening. That evening the station felt strangely quiet. The tension from the afternoon meeting had faded, but its effects remained. Officers who had barely acknowledged Ava Brooks during her first day now glanced at her with curiosity. Some nodded when they passed her desk. Others seemed unsure what to think. The woman they had dismissed as an inexperienced newcomer had identified a problem that senior personnel had overlooked. Ava noticed the change, but she did not react to it. Instead, she gathered her notebook, finished her reports, and prepared for the community meeting she and Daniel Price had been assigned to attend. The meeting took place in a modest recreation center on the east side of the city. Folding chairs filled the room. Families sat together. Small business owners discussed neighborhood concerns. Teachers spoke about after-school programs. Ava spent most of the evening listening. She took notes. Asked thoughtful questions. Remembered names. Daniel watched her work with growing respect. More than once he noticed residents responding to her immediately. She never interrupted. Never rushed anyone. She simply listened. By the time the meeting ended, several community leaders were thanking her for attending. Outside, the air was cool. Streetlights reflected across damp sidewalks left behind by the previous day's rain. Daniel walked beside her toward the patrol vehicle. "You have done this before," he said. Ava smiled slightly. "A few times." Most officers spend those meetings staring at the clock. "People notice when you do that." Daniel laughed quietly. "You really are different." Ava looked toward the city skyline glowing against the night sky. "No. I just learned a long time ago that trust takes longer to build than people think." The drive back to the station passed in comfortable silence. When they arrived, most of the building was already empty. Only a handful of officers remained finishing reports. Ryan Keller's office light was still on. Through the partially open blinds, Ava could see him sitting alone behind his desk reviewing paperwork. For the first time since she arrived, he looked tired. Not angry. Not confident. Just tired. Ava continued down the hallway without stopping. A few minutes later she entered a small unused office at the far end of the administrative wing. The room contained little more than a desk, a chair, and a single lamp casting a warm circle of light across the surface. She closed the door softly behind her. Then she reached into her bag and removed a worn leather case. Inside rested an old police badge. The silver edges had faded with time. The engraved name beneath the shield still remained clear. Marcus Brooks. Her father's badge. Ava held it carefully for a moment. Memories surfaced quietly. Early mornings. Long conversations. Lessons about leadership and responsibility. Lessons that had shaped every decision she had made throughout her career. The station beyond the walls remained silent. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked steadily. Ava placed the badge on the desk and sat beside it. Tomorrow the waiting would end. Tomorrow the truth would finally be revealed. Yet instead of satisfaction, she felt something else. Concern. Because the files she had reviewed, the conversations she had heard, and the attitudes she had witnessed all pointed toward the same conclusion. This department did not need punishment. It needed guidance. It needed trust. It needed someone willing to lead rather than simply command. Ava looked at her father's badge one final time before switching off the lamp. In the darkness, only a faint glow from the hallway remained. And beyond that glow waited the morning that would change everything. The next morning arrived clear and bright. Sunlight streamed through the station windows, painting long golden lines across the floor as officers filed into the roll call room carrying coffee, tablets, and half-finished conversations. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had all week. The successful traffic revision from the previous day had spread through the department faster than anyone expected. More than a few officers had quietly begun wondering whether Ava Brooks was really as inexperienced as she appeared. Even so, most of them still believed she was simply a capable newcomer. Ryan Keller certainly did. He stood near the front of the room speaking confidently with several supervisors. Every now and then he glanced toward the back row where Ava sat quietly reviewing a small notebook. She looked completely relaxed. That somehow irritated him more than open defiance ever could. At exactly 8 o'clock the room settled into silence. Chairs stopped moving. Conversations ended. Ryan stepped toward the podium and cleared his throat. Let us get started. Before he could continue, the main doors opened. Every head turned. 3 unfamiliar figures entered the room. First came Deputy Chief Harold Bennett. Behind him walked City Manager Laura Whitmore. The appearance of either official would have been unusual. Seeing both at the same time immediately changed the mood. Officers sat straighter. Conversations vanished. Ryan frowned slightly. This visit had not been on the schedule. Deputy Chief Bennett approached the front of the room carrying a folder. Good morning, everyone. His voice was calm but formal. Before assignments begin, we have an important announcement. Ryan exchanged a quick glance with several supervisors. Across the room, Ava quietly closed her notebook. Bennett continued. As many of you know, the department has spent several months conducting a nationwide search for new leadership. A ripple of attention moved through the room. Ryan's expression sharpened. For years he had assumed he would eventually occupy the top position. Many others assumed the same thing. Bennett opened the folder. After extensive review, the city selected a candidate with exceptional experience in community relations, departmental reform, operational leadership, and officer development. Ryan straightened his uniform slightly. Several officers glanced toward him. The moment seemed obvious. Predictable. Expected. Then Bennett smiled. "Please join me in welcoming your new commander." He turned toward the back of the room. Commander Ava Brooks. For one heartbeat nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. The room simply froze. Ava rose from her chair. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. She stepped forward calmly, her polished badge catching the morning light. Ryan's face drained of color. One officer nearly dropped his coffee cup. Another stared in disbelief. Daniel Price looked from Ava to the deputy chief and back again, suddenly understanding every strange detail from the past several days. The room that had laughed at her now watched in complete silence as she walked toward the front. Each step seemed to erase another assumption. Another judgment. Another careless remark. Ava stopped beside Deputy Chief Bennett. The sunlight from the windows illuminated her uniform. Not a trace of anger appeared on her face. Not a hint of triumph. Only quiet professionalism. Bennett extended a hand. "Welcome, Commander." Ava shook it. Behind her, dozens of officers remained frozen in stunned silence. And Ryan Keller realized that the woman he had spent days treating like a rookie had been his commanding officer from the very beginning. The silence inside the roll call room seemed to stretch forever. No one knew where to look. Some officers stared at the floor. Others stared at Ava Brooks as if seeing her for the first time. Ryan Keller remained motionless near the podium. Every joke, every dismissive comment, every assumption replayed in his mind with painful clarity. Ava stood calmly beside Deputy Chief Bennett and waited for the room to settle. She did not appear angry. She did not appear satisfied. If anything, she appeared exactly the same as she had on her first day. Professional. Focused. Steady. Bennett eventually stepped aside and nodded toward her. "Commander Brooks would like to say a few words." Ava moved toward the front of the room. The morning sunlight reflected softly across her badge. She placed her notebook on the podium and looked across the faces in front of her. Some were nervous. Some embarrassed. Some curious. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was calm and measured. "Over the last few days I have had the opportunity to observe this department from a unique perspective." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. "I reviewed reports. I attended meetings. I spoke with community members. I watched officers work under pressure. And I learned something important." Ava paused briefly. "This department has talented people." Several officers looked surprised. That was not the speech they expected. "I saw officers who care about this city. I saw people willing to work long hours. I saw people solving problems every day." The tension in the room eased slightly. Then Ava continued. "But I also saw something else. I saw communication problems. I saw frustration. I saw people who stopped believing their voices mattered." Her words landed softly but carried weight. Nobody could deny them. She had seen the department exactly as it was. Ava rested one hand on the podium. Leadership is not about rank. It is not about titles. And it is not about who speaks the loudest in a room. Leadership is about helping people succeed. Across the room, Daniel Price nodded quietly. Ryan lowered his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely ashamed of his own behavior. Ava's gaze moved through the room until it settled briefly on him. The moment felt unavoidable. Everyone noticed it. Yet there was no accusation in her expression. No humiliation. No desire for revenge. "Some of us have not started this week the way we should have," she said. "That includes all of us. Including me. But what matters now is what we do next." Ryan slowly looked up. Confusion crossed his face. She was giving him an opportunity. Not excusing his actions. Not ignoring them. Simply offering a chance to move forward. Ava continued. This department does not need division. It needs trust. It needs accountability. And it needs every person in this room working toward the same goal. The room remained completely silent. But the silence felt different now. It no longer carried shock. It carried reflection. When Ava finished speaking, she closed her notebook. I am proud to serve alongside you. Let us get to work. For a moment nobody moved. Then something unexpected happened. Ryan Keller stood first. Slowly, he began to applaud. The sound echoed through the room. One officer joined him. Then another. Within seconds the entire room followed. And as the applause filled the station, Ryan realized that the strongest person in the building was not the one who held authority. It was the one who had every reason to embarrass him and chose dignity instead. 3 weeks later, the station felt like a different place. The change had not happened overnight. It arrived in small moments. Officers stayed longer to help one another. Training sessions filled up instead of being ignored. Community meetings drew larger attendance. Complaints decreased. Trust slowly returned. On a bright Friday afternoon, sunlight poured through the front windows and reflected across the polished floor of the main lobby. Ava Brooks stood near the reception desk reviewing a report while residents came and went throughout the day. Several stopped to greet her by name. Others thanked the department for recent improvements. Ava accepted every compliment the same way. With a smile and a reminder that progress belonged to the entire team. Down the hallway, Ryan Keller paused outside her office. In his hand rested a folder he had rewritten 3 separate times. He stared at the door for a moment before finally knocking. Come in, Ava called. Ryan stepped inside. The office was simple. A desk. A bookshelf. A framed photograph of Marcus Brooks wearing his uniform years earlier. Ava looked up from her paperwork. Sergeant. Ryan stood quietly for a second. Then he placed the folder on her desk. The updated leadership development proposal. Ava glanced through the pages. It was thorough. Detailed. Better than anything she had seen from him before. This is excellent work, she said. Ryan nodded once. Thank you. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Finally Ryan exhaled. There is something else I wanted to say. Ava closed the folder. Go ahead. He looked toward the window before meeting her eyes. When you arrived here, I made assumptions. His voice remained steady, but the weight behind the words was clear. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I was wrong. Ava listened without interrupting. Ryan continued. You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone. You had every opportunity. Instead, you gave me a chance to be better. The office became quiet again. Outside, distant conversations echoed through the hallway. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair. People make mistakes, Ryan. He gave a small laugh. Some bigger than others. What matters is what happens after them. Ryan nodded slowly. For the first time in many years, he understood exactly what leadership looked like. It was not authority. It was not pride. It was not being the loudest person in the room. It was the ability to build people instead of tearing them down. A few minutes later he left the office. Ava returned to her paperwork. Through the window beside her desk, she could see the American flag moving gently in the afternoon breeze. The sunlight caught the silver edge of her father's old badge resting on a shelf nearby. For a moment she simply looked at it. Then she smiled. Outside, officers prepared for the evening shift. Patrol cars rolled from the parking lot one by one. The city continued its rhythm beyond the station walls. Inside, the department moved forward together. No speeches followed. No dramatic announcements. No final confrontation. Just the quiet sound of people doing their jobs with a little more respect than before. And as the sun drifted lower across the skyline, the station settled into a calm that felt different from silence. It felt like trust.